Hey guys, and welcome to my quarter one wrap-up. So today is the 31st, tomorrow is April 1st. That means that we have had 3 months of the year so far, in which mostly all I have done is recovered from COVID. So I have read 5 books, 4 of which were this past month. Yay. Let's talk about them. The only book that I didn't read in March was in January. The first book I read this year was Concrete Rose by Angie Thomas. I did do a full review of this one, so I'm not going to speak very much about it. If you would like to go hear my thoughts on that, please go watch that video. Essentially, this one is a young adult contemporary. If you've read The Hate You Give, this is technically a prequel to that. This is about Star, the protagonist of The Hate You Give's father, when he was in high school. So if that gives you any idea of whether or not you would like it, I know The Hate You Give is super popular. This one is also quite popular. So if you're going to read it, you probably already have. But if you would like to hear my review, my thoughts of it, why I think you should definitely read it, please go watch that video. I believe I gave this one 4 stars. Let me double check. 4.5 stars, even better. Pretty good start to the year. Definitely something I think people should read, but again, go watch that video for my full thoughts. The next book that I read actually isn't out to the public yet. I read an ARC advanced reader copy of it. That was The Final Girls Support Group by Grady Hendrix. Folks might recognize that name because he wrote the Southern Book Club's Guide to Vampire Slaying, which was quite popular last year. This year, obviously, Final Girls Support Group. Highly recommend it. It is my first 5-star read of the year. I read it the very beginning of this month. As a bookseller, I get ARCs through work. I am planning to do a review of this one, but obviously I'm going to post that closer to when the book itself comes out. It's coming out this summer. I loved this one way more than I liked Southern Book Club's Guide to Vampire Slaying. I liked this one way more. I think the pacing in this one is way faster, and that really helps. Also, the genre that this one is playing into, I haven't read a lot in books. I've seen a lot in movies, but it also does something new, and I think that especially for a lot of millennial readers who grew up with these movies, or even Gen Xers who grew up with these movies, are really going to like this one. Same sort of idea, where it's a horror setting with middle-aged women, so if you liked the Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires, you might like this one as well. But I will say, while that one was quite slow-paced and more of a slow burn kind of spooky novel, this one's a lot more action-packed type of horror. The next book that I read and finished, unsurprisingly because of how short it is The Empress of Salt and Fortune, and I actually have the sequel to it now as well, which I'm hoping to read this next coming month when the tiger comes down the mountain. So the only one I've read so far is The Empress of Salt and Fortune. It is a novella that reads almost like a fairy tale if fairy tales were Asian. So not mythology, specifically fairy tales, which are more like parables, stories that are meant to teach you a little bit of a lesson. They usually have frame narratives, something like that. This one is definitely like that. The characters in this one are named after animals, and I'm not sure if that's because they are animals as if depicted on the cover, or if those animals are meant to be specific representations of like what that animal stereotype is, which is not necessarily the same as what the characteristic stereotypes of what those animals would be in Western culture. It could be very different from like what somebody who's from Eastern culture might perceive those animals to have. But it was really quick, really short. I listened to the audiobook while reading this one. Highly recommend it. Beautiful storytelling. I ended up giving this one 3.75 stars. Really enjoyed it. It would have been a 4-star on Goodreads, but obviously with Storygraph I'm allowed to do decimals. I did have to read it twice for comprehension. It's one of those books where it's written very beautifully, and I think the language is chosen very intentionally. And I don't know if my brain post-COVID just wasn't working and I wasn't able to focus on it and completely understand what was going on, but I felt like I finished it and didn't really know what I read and had to go back and reread it and then got a better grasp of it. But even now, as I'm trying to describe it to you, I feel like I'm struggling to do that. So maybe I need to read it a third time in order to completely understand it. And I may still do that leading up to reading the second one to make sure that I am like comfortable going into that space. People who I think would like this, obviously people who read a lot of East Asian literature or who enjoy stories based off of East Asian folklore. This is very similar to that. It's also a fantasy book, so if you are a person who enjoys fantasy, specifically fantasy that takes place with royals, because it has to do with an empress who was sent from a faraway empire to for a political marriage, and her relationship with her servants at the time. It's a quite quiet little story that takes place there with a lot of lessons being learned and some interesting world development. So obviously fantasy readers will like it as well. But honestly, it's like under 200 pages. If anybody wants to pick it up, it's an interesting story and might be worth the read. The next book that I read, Gretchen and I did a joint review of last week, 2 weeks ago now. I feel like it was last week at this point the review went up. But that is The Cruel Prince by Holly Black. I also gave it 3.75 stars, probably 4 stars for folks, and Gretchen has since then read the entire series and done a series review of it. I enjoyed the protagonist of that one. I enjoyed the premise to the story of a normal girl raised among fairies who is trying to find her place in a world where she will always be considered lesser. Obviously those tones and stories are things that I go back to time and time again. I did have some issues with the writing itself and a lot of issues with the romance elements of it. And for a YA fantasy story where what people seem to really love about the story is the romance elements, I don't get it. But it was fast-paced. I enjoyed the world. I enjoyed the premise of it. So obviously still a good book. Still something that I would recommend to folks. Maybe not my favorite book that I read this year, though. And the last book that I have finished, Everybody Has a Podcast, Except for You, by the McElboys. The McElboys, Justin Travis, and Griffin McElroy. I have for a long time wanted to have my own podcast. I've tried a couple times to do different types of ones and never really succeeded at that, so I wanted to read this one and hear their advice, as I listened to several of their podcasts. You might recognize them as the First Podcasting Family. They have a huge array of podcasts from varying different styles and tones. Their founding podcast, the first one that they did, My Brother and Me, is one that I listen to weekly, which is a comedy advice podcast. They also do a live play D&D podcast called The Adventure Zone, where they play Dungeons & Dragons with their dad and other role-playing games after the first one. The first one was traditionally Dungeons & Dragons, and they have done other games since then. But there's that one. The brothers each have a podcast with their wives. Justin also does like a cereal podcast about cereal history and culture, and like the new releases of like literally breakfast cereal. So they've been doing things on so many different subjects, and clearly they're successful at it. They all do podcasting full time as their job at this point, and while it did take them a decade to get to that point, I think they have a lot of wisdom on the do's and don'ts, and also especially for people who just want to start a podcast, what equipment to use, what things that you want to invest money in versus just using free software if you can, versus, is it okay to get a cheaper mic? Do you need the $200 professional quality mic and soundboard setup thing? All of that stuff, but also just more ephemeral advice, like how to name your podcast, or when you're looking on building a podcast, what should your podcast be? Things like that is also in here. And in true McElroy fashion, it's very funny. They interject each other with little bubbles where one of them will add in something on the other one's like chapter. It's very cute and funny, and I highly recommend it if you like the McElroys, for one thing, but also just if you want to start a podcast. It's like an easy, digestible how-to guide. The last book that I want to talk about I have not finished, but I have been slowly working my way through Stamped from the Beginning. I just did a video last week where I talked about some of the anti-racist books that I'm trying to slowly make my way through and read and give the time of day. This is not something that I want to rush through just to finish it. I've been trying to internalize and think about everything that has been said here and doing a lot of unlearning of American history, because the American education system doesn't do a good job of showing the actual atrocities that go on, along with where the racist ideas that we have in this country come from. Some of them are inherited from European ideas, but a lot of them are homegrown, and this shows the events that took place that led to the catalysts of these ideas, and especially also that led to the legal system and systemic problems that we have today as far as racism, like where those came from, the actual events that led to legislature that is racist or structures that are racist as well. Highly recommend this, but I haven't finished it yet, so I'm gonna count it. I've been reading it, I just haven't finished it. It's a chunky boy. It's a chunky boy. As far as what I'm planning to read in quarter 2, there obviously are a lot of books that I would like to read. Behind me, I have hundreds of TBR books, but I also have a bunch of arcs that I want to read for the next 3 months. Obviously, I've already read the Final Girl Support Group, which comes out in the next quarter, but there are other books, especially, I think I have like 3 or 4 books that come out in May that I'm going to be talking about to you guys, that are arcs that I already have and have started reading but haven't finished yet. And then, yeah, that's where I'm sitting. I've read 5 books. I feel like a failure, but I also have to give myself a little bit of leeway because I didn't read for pretty much 2 months because of COVID. I'm going to be watching a bunch of other people's wrap-ups, whether they're quarter wrap-ups or monthly wrap-ups, so you can find me there. I will talk to you again next week. I hope you guys are having lovely lives, lovely days. See you then.